60 years. That's how long American farmers owned Japan's wheat market. Not competed for it, owned it. On March 6, 2026, that ended. Canada signed one agreement in Tokyo, and $5 billion in annual market share began moving north of the border. Here's what no one is asking. Was this an accident? Or did Trump's own tariff strategy hand Canada the keys? I'm going to show you exactly how this happened, layer by layer. Because once you see the mechanism, you'll never look at trade wars the same way again. Japan imports approximately 195 million bushels of wheat every single year. Its domestic farms produce enough to cover roughly 18% of that demand. The remaining 82% must come from somewhere else. And for 6 decades, the United States was first in line. This isn't a commodity story. This is a food security story. Japan cannot stockpile its way out of a supply disruption. The country runs on imported grain. Every major flour miller, every bread manufacturer, every confectionery company in Japan operates on the assumption that foreign wheat arrives on schedule, at consistent quality, every single shipment. That dependency creates enormous strategic leverage for whoever holds the supplier position. And here is the part most analysts miss entirely. Japan's Ministry of Agriculture doesn't buy wheat the way a company shops for the cheapest option. It runs a controlled tender system. It evaluates suppliers on reliability, quality, consistency, and geopolitical stability, not just price. Price is almost the last consideration, which means the country that wins Japan's wheat market doesn't win on cost. It wins on trust. And in early 2026, Canada had more of it than America did. March 6th, 2026, Tokyo. Mark Carney walks into a meeting with Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba Shigeru and does something no one expected. He opens with several sentences in Japanese. Not a translator, not a prepared English statement read through an interpreter. Carney, directly, in Japanese. The room responds with applause. That moment matters more than it appears. In Japanese diplomatic culture, the gesture signals something specific. I studied your country before I came here. I take this seriously. It reframes the entire meeting before a single policy point is discussed. What followed was the signing of a comprehensive strategic partnership between Canada and Japan, covering defense, energy, critical minerals, technology, and agriculture. The agreement wasn't improvised. It landed on the 50th anniversary of the Canada-Japan Joint Economic Committee and the 40th anniversary of their agreement on cooperation in science and technology. The timing was deliberate. This was a relationship being upgraded, not started. The defense components made headlines. 3 bilateral memorandums covering emergency response, Coast Guard coordination, and illegal fishing enforcement. Japan signaled it was considering participation in Operation Nanook Canada's annual Arctic sovereignty exercise. A defense equipment and technology transfer agreement, signed in January 2026, opened the door for Canadian and Japanese defense firms to collaborate directly. But buried inside the agricultural provisions was the number that should have alarmed Washington immediately. Canada had overtaken the United States to become Japan's #1 supplier of both wheat and pork. Not closing the gap, not gaining ground, first place. And beyond wheat and pork, Canada now supplies an estimated 10% of Japan's total caloric intake, a figure that represents years of deepening supply relationships, not months. Carney didn't create this shift in Tokyo. He formalized it. The agreement committed both countries to deploying trade delegations, a Team Canada trade mission to Japan in 2026, a reciprocal visit to Canada by the Japan Business Federation. These missions exist to lock in what markets already started building. The signing ceremony was the public confirmation of a structural change that had already happened underneath the surface. And Washington, for the most part, wasn't watching. To understand why this shift is permanent, you need to understand 3 things. Not 1, 3 in order. Layer 1, how Japan actually buys wheat. Japan's Ministry of Agriculture, Forestry, and Fisheries controls 100% of wheat imports through a government tender system. The ministry purchases wheat from registered traders, then resells it to flour millers at a fixed price, recalculated every 6 months based on weighted average purchasing cost, plus a markup that funds domestic wheat production subsidies. This is not a free market. Individual flour millers cannot simply call a Canadian exporter and place an order. The government sits in the middle of every transaction. which means when the ministry shifts its purchasing preference toward Canadian suppliers, that decision carries institutional weight. It doesn't reverse when a new American trade representative sends a strongly worded letter. It reverses when Japan's Ministry of Agriculture formally reorients its tender criteria, a process that takes years, not quarters. Layer 2. Why Canadian wheat specifically? Canada doesn't win this market on price alone. It wins on product fit. Canadian Western Red Spring wheat competes directly with American hard red spring wheat for bread flour production, the highest volume category. But Canada also exports Western white wheat, which Japanese confectionery manufacturers use specifically for sponge cakes and biscuits. These are distinct product categories, with distinct quality specifications, and Canadian supply covers both. Beyond wheat, Canada exports canola seed, soybeans, and pork to Japan in significant volumes. When Japanese officials evaluate Canada as a supplier, they're not evaluating one product. They're evaluating an integrated agricultural package. The breadth of that package makes Canada harder to replace than any single commodity supplier. Layer 3. Switching costs, and this is the one that makes the shift permanent. When Japan's top flour millers and 4 companies control approximately 80% of the entire market, establish supply relationships with Canadian grain elevators, they don't just sign a contract. They invest in understanding Canadian wheat protein specifications across different growing regions. They invest in optimizing Pacific shipping, logistics vessel, scheduling, port coordination, delivery timing calibrated to Canadian harvest cycles. They build institutional knowledge about quality variance between crop years and how to adjust milling processes accordingly. This knowledge becomes an asset that took years to build and would take years to rebuild if they switched back to American suppliers. So, consider the calculation a Japanese flour mill executive faces. American wheat might become price competitive again in 2 years if trade policy stabilizes. But returning to American supply means dismantling Canadian logistics infrastructure, retraining procurement teams, reestablishing quality verification processes, and rebuilding relationships with American grain traders, all of which cost money and introduce the supply uncertainty that triggered the switch in the first place. The rational decision is to stay with Canada. This is why the $5 billion figure isn't just a current year loss for American farmers. It's a compounding loss. Every year, Canadian supply relationships deepen. The switching cost for Japanese millers increases. Every year, returning to American wheat becomes more expensive, not less. Trump's team called Carney's diversification strategy virtue signaling. What they missed is that switching costs don't care about political rhetoric. They accumulate quietly, transaction by transaction, shipment by shipment, until the reorientation becomes structural, and reversal becomes economically irrational. That's exactly where Japan is now. Here is the paradox at the center of this entire story. Trump imposed 25% tariffs on Canadian goods in February 2025. The stated justification was fentanyl trafficking. The strategic assumption was leverage that Canada's deep dependence on American market access would force Ottawa into compliance, and that economic pressure would produce political concessions. The calculation was not unreasonable on paper. Approximately 75% of Canadian exports flow to the United States. That kind of concentration creates vulnerability. Threaten the market, threaten the economy, extract the concession. But the calculation had a fatal blind spot. It assumed the damage would stay bilateral between Washington and Ottawa. It didn't account for the audience watching from Tokyo. Japanese officials observed the 2025 tariff cycle with a specific question in mind. Not a political question, but a supply chain question. If the United States applies arbitrary trade restrictions to Canada, its closest democratic ally and largest trading partner, what prevents Washington from doing the same to Japanese imports during a future dispute? Japan cannot afford to answer that question wrong. The country imports 82% of its wheat. A supply disruption doesn't create an economic inconvenience. It creates a food security crisis. When you are that exposed, you do not build critical supply chains around partners whose trade policy operates outside predictable legal frameworks. Canada offered the alternative: stable regulatory environment, consistent export policy, a government that, even under significant economic pressure, continued honoring existing trade commitments. From a risk management perspective, the choice wasn't close. And here is the irony that should follow Trump's trade legacy permanently. The tariffs were designed to demonstrate American leverage. Instead, they demonstrated American unreliability. Every threat, every escalation, every unpredictable policy announcement didn't weaken Canada, it advertised Canada to every trading partner watching the pattern unfold. Scott Bessant, Treasury Secretary, publicly mocked Carney's diversification push as virtue signaling. Howard Lutnick complained about Canadian whining. These statements were made while Canadian officials were in Tokyo signing binding agreements with decade-long implications. While American officials were crafting dismissive talking points, Canadian wheat was physically displacing American wheat inside Japanese flour mills, one shipment, one purchase order, one long-term supply contract at a time. The scoreboard doesn't record the rhetoric, it records the contracts. And in 2026, the contracts belong to Canada. Wheat is the most visible number. It is not the whole story. Canada now supplies an estimated 10% of Japan's total caloric intake. That figure spans wheat, pork, canola, and soybeans, an integrated agricultural footprint that took decades to build and now anchors Japanese food security in ways that extend far beyond any single commodity. Energy follows the same logic. The comprehensive strategic partnership commits both countries to expanding cooperation on liquefied natural gas and liquefied petroleum gas. Carney stated in Tokyo that Canada has the capacity to double its LNG exports by the end of this decade and double again by the end of the following decade. Japanese Prime Minister Ishiba responded by calling Canada's LNG expansion plans strategically significant for Japan's energy security. The language was precise and deliberate. Japan is not shopping for a new energy supplier. It is selecting a long-term strategic partner. The automotive sector completes the pattern. As American automakers reduced Canadian assembly operations under pressure from the Trump administration to consolidate manufacturing inside the United States, Japanese companies moved in the opposite direction. Honda and Toyota now account for 77% of all light vehicles produced in Canada as of early 2026, up from 44% in 2016. Japanese capital is deepening its commitment to Canadian manufacturing at the exact moment American capital is pulling back. Wheat, LNG, automobiles. Three separate industries, one identical logic. Reduce exposure to American policy volatility. Build durable supply relationships with partners who operate inside stable, predictable frameworks. Invest where the regulatory environment makes long-term planning possible. Japan is not reacting to a single tariff. It is executing a strategic reorientation of its most critical supply chains, food, energy, and industrial production, away from American dependency and toward Canadian reliability. The wheat market was the first number large enough to measure publicly. It will not be the last. 60 years. That's what American farmers lost. Not because Canadian wheat is cheaper, not because Canada has more of it. Because when Japan's Ministry of Agriculture sat down to evaluate its suppliers, one country offered volume with uncertainty and the other offered reliability with stability. In food security, that is never a difficult choice. Trump's tariff strategy assumed economic pressure produces compliance. What it produced instead was a permanent realignment of the world's fourth largest economy away from American agricultural supply chains. One purchase order at a time, one long-term contract at a time, until reversal became economically irrational. Canada didn't steal this market. America handed it over. Next video, India. A market 3 times the size of Japan, and Carney is already in the room.